Who, who says women don't have power in the church there, Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay, so for our first question, we're going to follow on, Raymond, from your talk on the culture of death. And this question is, how would you explain the push and desire for euthanasia and the wish to hasten death in a culture that is afraid of speaking of death, has so many euphemisms for death, and is generally very touchy with the subject?
I believe that the basic reason for the push in favor of euthanasia is the mentality that has taken over a large number of our contemporaries, whereby I don't want any suffering in my life, neither me nor I don't want to see anybody suffering. I want to have a perfect life. So if I see anybody who is sick, let's ignore them. If they can be helped to die, let's kill them. The refusal to accept the cross in life, refusal to accept suffering in life, which is a natural consequence of being alive. That suffering is part and parcel of life. But this refusal, we want to make a paradise on earth. We want to have no problems at all. And I cannot see anybody suffering. I'd rather kill them instead of suffering. That's the impression I've had by visiting several countries. The desire behind in the back of people's minds about helping people to die is not to help them at all, but just to help me, because I don't want to see any suffering.
Does anyone else have a comment on that one?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. No? Can you hear? No. All right. Can you hear me now? Good. Yes. Okay. I think a forgotten element in all this area of the euthanasia debate from our Catholic perspective is we need to remind ourselves and proclaim to others that we have a wonderful sacrament called anointing of the sick, which is what these people at this time of at this end point in their lives, with their suffering that they're enduring, that's what we should be giving them. We shouldn't be giving them the needle or whatever to terminate their life. Our Lord provided something for this moment as they approach death, as they transition to the next world. The sacrament of anointing will bring them peace, will bring them reconciliation and the forgiveness of their sins. And in some rare cases, very rare cases, but I've heard priests testify to this, it actually does heal certain people. And another thing we need to reignite in the mentalities of people is a spiritual value in suffering. The last book I recently completed reading was an old one by Fulton Sheen that he wrote in the 40s called Go to Heaven. I had this on my library shelf for decades, and I thought I'll never get around reading this. But I read it, and it was his response to the term we use when we insult people and we say go to hell. He said, well, we'll go to heaven. And there's one line in that book where he actually says the problem with Western society is that we've forgotten about the spiritual value of suffering. We need to recapture that and teach people that they can offer up suffering to God as a prayer, like fasting, and there's a redemptive value in it, and united with Christ's suffering on the cross.
Thanks, Robert. So sticking with end-of-life issues, and Trent, I might throw this one to you. When a person had a massive stroke and pronounced by the doctor that she was brain dead, would it be all right to remove all artificial aid to prolong her life?
The Catholic Church does not teach that someone has a moral duty to stay alive as long as possible. We understand that death is a natural thing. It's not something that was ever God's intent for us, so it is bad in the sense it was never part of God's plan. But the good thing about death is that it is the door we step through to have eternal life with Christ. So it's something that we accept as a natural part of our life. So we should not directly kill people, of course, to walk them. We shouldn't be shoving people through the door, but we should be holding their hand as they naturally pass through that. In the year 2000, Pope St. John Paul II gave a talk on organ transplants and donors. When someone has died, when can you remove, is it licit to donate and remove their organs, to donate them for scientific research or for health purposes? And the Pope said the church teaches that yes, it's very meritorious, it's a beautiful thing to donate organs from someone who actually is dead. Now you can't do that to someone who merely is in an unconscious state or a irreversible coma. This person is not dead, they are disabled. But someone who is actually dead, you don't give life support to someone who is dead. Now, well, what is death? The church teaches that death is when the soul leaves the body. So we are composites of body and soul. The soul is the animating principle of life. It's what makes a living thing, not a dead thing. And we have immortal souls. The problem is that's not a great, to say we die when the soul leaves the body is not a great medical definition of death, because the soul is immaterial, we can't weigh it, you can't do experiments to determine that. So in 2000, Pope St. John Paul II spoke at this conference and endorsed what is called the total brain death criteria, to say that someone who has that the church generally accepts that someone has died when they have complete and total irreversible cessation of electrical activity in the brain. And so someone who is quote unquote brain dead, they are dead. Now, some bioethicists misunderstand this and have tried to argue that a person is dead when they have only suffered upper brain death. But that, once again, that's not death. That would be a disability and someone we should care for because they still have their lower brain, which can regulate heartbeat and breathing, things like that. But someone who has suffered a total and complete irreversible cessation of brain function, it would be futile to provide them life support or heart-lung machine because they have died. We're just at this point, we would just be keeping a corpse from decomposing. So at this point, because the soul has left the body, we show respect for the body, allow the person to die naturally, and if possible, we can donate vital organs to support other sick people or scientific research and things like that, if someone is legitimately dead or brain dead.
Thank you, very clear. Moving from the end of life right to the very beginning of life, we have a question for anyone on the panel. When we talk about life from conception and a new soul from the moment of conception, how do we explain that in terms of identical twins who start from a single fertilized ovum?
I'll take a stab at this. And any other gentleman want to add in, that would be fine. In 1974, the Vatican issued a declaration on procured abortion, and it talked about the issue of ensoulment. The church does not have an official position on when the soul enters the body. There has been disagreement among theologians throughout church history, though I think the most probable view is that because the soul is the principle of life, remember the soul is what makes you a living body, not a dead body, the most probable view is that we receive our souls at the moment the body comes into existence, which would be a conception. But in a footnote of that declaration, the 1974 declaration, the church said there has been disagreement, there is not an official view on this question. However, abortion is still wrong because you have a living human body and you have a risk of killing someone who either has an immortal soul or doesn't, or at the very least is a human being waiting to receive that soul. But I would say the most probable view is we receive the soul at the beginning of the body's existence. Now the question of twins is an interesting one when it comes to bioethics. So identical twins, or what's also called monozygotic twins, this occurs prior to 14 days of embryonic development. So as the embryo develops in the womb, prior to the point of developing what's called the primitive streak, this is the precursor to the vertebrae, or the backbone, it's possible for the embryo to split and to become two different embryos with identical DNA, identical twins. So what's going on here with the soul and the development of the body? We aren't entirely sure. There are different proposals to describe what is happening here, but none of them, so some people bring up twinning to justify abortion or embryo research prior to 14 days, to say that it's not a person because it can twin. Well, that's not true. Just because one being can become two beings doesn't mean the one being never existed. If you take a flatworm and bisect it, you have two worms. But that doesn't mean there was no single worm before I made the cut. So what's going on here? It could be possible that you have one embryo that is a human being with a soul, but upon twinning, that human being dies and gives rise to two new human beings with two immortal, and ensoulment occurs at that moment. It could also be the case that you have one organism with one soul, and then another organism comes from that with a new soul that is infused at that moment, let's say 10 days later. Just the same that you could make a twin from me if you took my body cell and put it into an egg. You could make a clone from me, but that doesn't mean I don't have a soul right now. The third option is it could be the case that upon conception for identical twins, you have one body that two souls inhabit, that you have sort of a dual existence that then divides into two distinct organisms. So you have a kind of two persons sharing one body, kind of similar to how you have conjoined twins, also called Siamese twins, but the correct term is conjoined twins. That you have, there are conjoined twins in Minnesota, I believe, two girls who share one trunk and they have two separate heads, yet they share one trunk below the neck. So it could be one of those three proposals, but none of them would disprove the existence of the most probable view that we have our souls at conception and that you ought not kill a human being at that point. So I hope that's helpful. And then if you have a fun question after that, that'd be fine too. Don't want to take up all of the complex nuanced ones.
Just to add, come on.
We'll share microphones, not bothering.
Okay, just to add one note, years ago I was in Costa Rica and there was a geneticist, a physician giving a talk, and he showed something that has been discovered only recently, that at the moment of a conception there is a spark of light. And I found this the most beautiful idea. Deus lux est, God is light. That when the first thing God created was light. Let there be light. And I thought, what a beautiful idea, but nobody knew about this. Only recently was discovered that there a spark of light happens, which shows the sacredness of motherhood, that she carries in her womb that spark of light, that new human soul. I found this just very beautiful to see how God, our Lord, thought of all these details in the creation, and only recently we have discovered that.
Wonderful. All right, next couple of questions are for you, Robert, so I might mix them together because we're talking about education in Australia. So the first one we've got is, how do we encourage our Catholic schools to employ RECs or directors of spirituality to follow the ideals of the faith more faithfully and not dilute the doctrine, especially on sexuality and marriage? And hold that thought because there's another very similar question. Schools in Australia are changing their sex education, including Catholic schools. Will Catholic schools at least be open about what the government want to teach our youth, or omit for them to learn them on the playground?
All right, two very important questions. I'll only answer from the perspective of Sydney Catholic Schools, which is our office at Leichhardt, which looks after all our system schools in the Archdiocese of Sydney. We currently have 152 schools, around 70 to 80,000 students. Now, with respect to RECs, religious education coordinators in primary and secondary, they are system appointments. They are not school appointments. So it's not the principal who appoints who the REC is. Though the principal will sit on the panel, the interview panel, and so would representatives from central office. And I've sat on many of those panels and interviewed some wonderful people. The final appointment when it comes to an REC in any school rests with my particular boss, the Director of Mission and Identity, Dr. Anthony Cleary. And we always try and employ the best person who has applied for the job. I go back 15 years before my boss was employed, and I'll say this, and this probably get me in trouble, but I'll say it anyway. Virtually all RECs from kindergarten to year 12 were old, female, short-haired, feminist man-haters. Get me in trouble, but that was basically the generic mould. There is virtually none left. I wasn't here yesterday because I was at an REC gathering of about 115 RECs primary, and we had the secondary one a week before. That whole territory has changed. Most of the RECs now, generally the average age in secondary would be around 35, and the average age in primary will be about 30. Mostly female, because our industry is 80% female, but most of them have long hair now. There's been enormous improvement in the faith and attitudes and practice of this group of people. There's still a lot of problems. There are enormous problems in our whole system, but the scene has changed, and I pray that it continues to change. We've got family educators now in the primary space. I've seen 4 family educators. They're here. Put your hand up now if you're a family educator in our system. Sorry for embarrassing you. Wonderful people, etc. Yeah, they deserve a clap. We will do our best to make sure we continue with this improvement. And even in the team I work with, in the last 7 years, I've seen incredible improvement. Virtually everyone, not everyone, but virtually everyone is now faithful and orthodox and practicing in our particular team. Can you just remind me, Monica, what was the second question?
The changing of sex education, and will the schools be open with parents about what the change in sex education?
Well, look, the changes, I presume that question is based on pressures that are coming from the outside. There are enormous pressures on our schools with respect to these issues, same-sex issues, staff in same-sex relationships, parents who are in same-sex relationships, transgender students. We had a crisis meeting yesterday at the most senior level in our school with respect to a transgendered student who was enrolled in one of our schools who was now suicidal, and there was an emergency meeting to deal with this pastoral aspect yesterday. But the pressure is there, but at the moment I can say that definitely our team and our curriculum, K to 6, 7 to 10 and 11 to 12, we have 3 curricula here, none of them are being impacted by the pressures that we're getting with respect to whatever the sexual revolution happens to be pushing at the moment. Our curricula, all of them have been reviewed since my boss has been in place, and all of them are faithful with respect to the faith and morals of our church, the perennial teachings of our church. I just hope that stays in place. I have to say this, while we have Archbishop Anthony, it will stay firm. My boss is accountable, not to the Executive Director of Schools, not to any particular auxiliary bishop. My boss is accountable directly to the Archbishop. He gets his mandate from him. I'm confident Sydney Catholic Schools will remain firm. I do not have that confidence with respect to independent and congregational schools. The Opus Dei schools, I have confidence there. My old school, St Charles College, I have confidence there. I wish I could be confident about every school, but I'm not.
Thanks, Robert. I might add a little bit to that. Towards the end of this year, we'll be having an inquiry by the Australian Law Reform Commission that will look directly at some of the legal protections that allow schools to keep among other things, that allow schools to keep their curricula faithful to the teachings of the church on things like sex education, with a view to taking those away. So that's the Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry into religious exemptions in anti-discrimination laws. It's going to be very, very important. And so as we move towards the latter half of the year, hopefully you'll be hearing from us on ways that you can get involved, particularly as parents, to make sure that your voices are heard, and to make sure that you tell the Law Reform Commission, and through them tell our parliamentarians that we want our faith-based schools to be allowed to continue to teach the faith, because otherwise they're just a waste of money. Staying with education, Trent, this next question's for you. I have noticed many of the speakers in America are alumni of Steubenville. Why do you think that is, and what do you think our Catholic universities can learn from Steubenville?
Sure. Well, I think when we go back in time and look in the United States, which was sort of a precursor for the revival, the Renaissance in apologetics. I guess if we go back in our history lesson, you go to the Second Vatican Council, there was a lot of good that happened for the church, but also there was confusion that came from the council. And one of those elements of confusion was the role of the laity, and the role when it comes to evangelizing and defending the faith. And many people came to the mindset of, really, that's for the clergy, that the bishops do that, Father does that, that's not my job to do that. And so in the US, what we had was in the 70s and 80s, there was a massive uptick in Protestant fundamentalists who were siphoning off Catholics from Catholic parishes. there was a gentleman named Carl Keating. He was a lawyer in around 1979 in San Diego, and this Baptist church had put these anti-Eucharist tracts on the cars of everyone in the parking lots. And so then Carl went home on his old typewriter, he wrote a response to them, and he called it the Catholic Answer. And he put it on the cars in their church. And then he rented a post office box and said, if you have questions, right here. And then and then 2 weeks later he checked the post office box, and it was full of letters, some angry, but others saying, we like what you wrote, can you please send us your catalog? And he gave a very Jesuitical answer. He said, we're all out of stock. So then he founded Catholic Answers, and that was around the time, that was around the time also when lay apologists were doing a lot of work to evangelize, were sharing their testimonies, Patrick Madrid, also Scott Hahn. So Scott Hahn, Patrick Madrid, Carl Keating were all working together around this time in the late 80s, early 90s. And Scott's conversion story, which later became the book Rome Sweet Home, was a bestseller. His conversion tapes were all over the place. And then I just had someone explain to me what a tape is, actually. This little device. No, I'm just kidding. I still know. That's the test to see if someone is Generation Z or Z. Give them a cassette tape and a pencil and ask them what are these things for. I still remember those. I remember copying songs off the radio with a cassette tape and a boombox. But Gen Z knows nothing about that. So Scott then became a professor at Steubenville and was known obviously for his orthodoxy and his genuine holiness and his academic rigor. And so his contribution along with the other staff at Franciscan University, because the school, and I've studied at Franciscan University of Steubenville, it is a beautiful school surrounded by an island of crime and not such a nice place in Steubenville, Ohio. I actually, to save money, I studied off campus, and I slept with my rosary and my Bursa 380 pistol because it was not that pleasant of a. Outside the campus, it's not that great a neighborhood. But on the campus itself, if you've ever been to Franciscan University in Steubenville, it's a beautiful campus. And it was previously a secular school. It was like a party school. And so then the Franciscans came, they purchased it, and it was completely overhauled, and Scott and the other administrators were fully on board saying, this is a Catholic school first. And so orthodoxy, right teaching, orthodoxy, and right way of living out the faith, orthopraxy, was the number one there. And so Scott then took it upon himself to disciple other people. That's the other thing why do so many people come out of Steubenville? Well, this is the principle of our faith, that the reason the Catholic faith is as big as it is, Jesus discipled 12 people who would go on and disciple others. St. Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:2. He said, what you have received from me in the presence of many faithful witnesses, teach others who will teach others. And that's the principle we need, that I call it, or others have called it, the multiplier effect. That we have to teach others who will go and teach others. That's what I try to do. Robert does, Raymond does. We want to teach others who will multiply and teach others, and it grows. It goes viral. Oh, too soon with coronavirus. But that's the idea, that you want it to go. So what Scott did, then he had his disciples have gone out, the people he's reached, like the people at the Augustine Institute, Edward Sri. Timothy Gray is someone who studied under Scott Hahn. Lots of other people I know were mentored under him, and then others were mentored under other people, and they go out and make these big differences. So then you can trace people back to the original mentor who formed them in those environments. So that's why we need good Catholic schools with authentic people who love the Lord with all their heart, mind, and strength. All of that together, and then they'll disciple people in it. It multiplies.
Thanks very much. Raymond, I might throw this next question at you, or the next couple, and you can mix them together. So the first is, what can we do as lay people when the priest supports abortion? Don't react just yet, I've got one more question, just wait. And if we find dissenting materials in the parish library, and we already spoke to the parish priest about it, and they agree that the book has its place, and if you don't agree with it, then don't read it. Do we be obedient? Do we go to the bishop, or do we take it to social media?
There are some stages to do in this. First of all, nobody is obliged to obey to do something wrong. Nobody. If the second question, not the first one, if the priest is in favor of abortion, there are 3 stages to do. St. Matthew chapter 18 tells us, first, approach him privately. Present to him why it is wrong. If he refuses to listen to you, take 2 or 3 witnesses and go to see him again. If he refuses that, then you go to the church. To the church, in this case concretely, it is the bishop or the tribunal. Or you can actually make a lawsuit in the tribunal of the Catholic Church against that particular priest. And social media is the end. This is the last. Then you have to go bananas with that. Let everybody knows who the individual is, etc., etc., etc. Actually, coming to think of it, the only time in the Gospels when our Lord Jesus Christ alluded to death penalty, when he said, if any of you were to scandalize the little ones that believe in me, it would be better to tie a millstone in your neck and cast you into the sea, which means that capital punishment by drowning for RE teachers is a lesser evil than allowing the little ones to lose their faith. I'm not suggesting we should go and drown them, the lot of them. I'm not suggesting this, but to oppose the priest in these 3 stages. If there is a book there in the library that is doing manifestly, doing harm to the people who go there, and he said, if you don't want it, you don't read it. I would take matters in my own hands. Remember what happened to the Pachamama idols in the Vatican? The Austrian Alexander, unpronounceable, whatever, he took them and cast them into the Tiber. I think he was wrong. He should have burned them. That should have done. Because it comes to a point when it is ridiculous to have a book manifestly against the faith or being allowed to stay there under the authority of a priest who should be, or a director, who should be defending the faith. I would publicly oppose it, and coming to the crunch at the end, I would get it and throw it into the garbage. Because to save the faith of the little ones is immensely more important. Our Lord is very clear about this, immensely more important than anything else. That's my view.
Does anyone else have something to add on that?
I don't have a specific prescription. One would have to follow their conscience in that regard. And to see it, it's hard to make a judgment just hearing the word a heretical book. But if there were a book causing this manifest harm, each person responds differently. I might check the book out of the library to research it, to refute it, and that process of refuting may last indefinitely. And so, and then perhaps I may replace it with something more edifying for people. But that's, each of us is moved by our conscience in a different way. So I might check it out to do a refutation, and I might misplace it on its way back. Who knows?
That's the difference between an Anglo-Saxon and a Latino. That's it.
Can we get a Maronite response?
What's a Maronite?
When Raymond was giving his response, I just couldn't help but think I'd be doing something very similar. I did have both views. I'm thinking, where would I stand here? I think both views are meritorious and correct. I'm rather scrupulous by nature, and I would feel instinctively that book certainly can't remain on the shelf. I probably would have borrowed it and never returned it and kept it at that. Yeah.
Or you can borrow it and say, gee, I lost it. Sorry, let's buy another one, a different kind of book.
$3 fine.
We do have, it's important though, when we are combating those who are being destructive to the faith, anyone who's being destructive, we always do have to be careful though, that I think that social media has its place as a weapon of last resort. But too often we're tempted just to go there immediately, and we forget about, the Catechism teaches about the sins of detraction and calumny. Things that we often forget nowadays. And what are those? Well, it's easy to remember. Calumny is when you share a lie about someone that hurts their reputation. And detraction is when you share something that's true but was unnecessary that other people did not need to know or have a right to know, that hurt the person's reputation. So to remember, the L in calumny stands for a lie that hurts someone, and the T in detraction stands for a truth. Not everyone has a right to that truth, to someone's faults or their sins. It may come a point where you reach the point where it has to go public because it's so serious and grave, but I think for many people that becomes a first instinct, which is very dangerous. The sin of detraction is a serious sin that one should only make matters public as a last resort, not as an instinct to get there first on social media.
That's a good point. So this next question is for me. And the question is, from a law perspective, what can we say or cannot say about abortion as a conscientious objector in public service, especially in healthcare? So from a legal perspective, when it comes to expressing your view on things like abortion, euthanasia, and other matters, there is a general freedom. We don't have a right to freedom of speech in Australia. Speech is able to be curtailed, particularly if it's seen as discriminatory, harassing, intimidating, bullying, and things like that. So the law is able to prescribe limitations on speech. It would be hard to make a case that speaking about a conscientious objection to abortion is any of those things. Obviously, we know that the law in Australia has put specific limitations on communicating about abortion within usually 150 metres of abortion clinics. We know that that's happened. We know that that is a very direct limitation on the freedom of speech and on the right to speak specifically about abortion. That doesn't happen if someone is seeking to protest on another matter. So you can protest on another matter in a lot closer proximity, but there are specific penalties for speech about abortion in those physical areas. Outside of that, unless somebody could make a case that it was bullying, intimidating, something like that. So say if you're in the workplace, you know someone who's had an abortion and you keep talking about your objection to abortion, how wrong it is, how bad it is, there is a potential there that could be seen as bullying or seen as intimidating, particularly when it's directed at an individual. But if you're just speaking about your conscientious objection to abortion, from a legal perspective, generally okay. What gets unfortunately a lot of healthcare professionals into difficulty is that the law isn't the only thing that governs the medical profession. So there are regulations put out by the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Authority. You've got your own employment considerations, and what we find is if you have an employee or a prospective employee who is open with their employer about their objection to things like abortion, then you might find yourself on the wrong side of employment conditions, or even sort of some type of unspoken discrimination, unspoken rejection of what you're doing. There's always a bit of a push to change the guidelines, the health practitioners regulation guidelines on things like this. Like there was a push I think last year to say that you could try and silence people whose views weren't in accordance with the generally accepted view of the medical community. And so that it could be professional misconduct for you if you spoke about something that wasn't in the general view of the medical community. And so things like abortion, but even increasingly things like transgender considerations and things like that, that's how the regulations get you. And you rely on the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Authority for your licence to practice medicine. So it's not necessarily the law that gets you, it's your own professional organisation and your own professional membership that can sometimes trip you up, so it's a little bit more difficult. I hope that answers the question.
It feels like sometimes it's a double standard, because I was talking with the students from Life Choices who do the pro-life work at uni here, and I don't know, the video of them yelling at you with bullhorns, that looked like bullying to me. Nobody seems to get in trouble for that, so don't worry, the same thing happens back in the States. I love our First Amendment, so I love having that, gives us a lot of freedom. But even with that, even in the United States, people try to shut us down on university campuses. They try to think craftier ways. One is called the Hecklers Veto. I've gone to schools and I'm going to give a talk or a debate, and the pro-life group is told, oh, you can have Trent Horn come and give a talk, but we're worried there might be protesters and it might get violent, so you can still have the talk. We just need you to pay about $6,000 in security fees. You know, we want to keep everyone safe, and this guy, Trent Horn, it could get out of hand. You just have to pay $6,000 and he can come. But then when the feminist group invites their feminist author to come, the university pays for it, and there's no worry there. And so there was a lawsuit related, not to me, but to a group related to me, at Arizona State University about this. And we actually won because they were trying to get around the First Amendment with these secretive fees and then burdens placed on people just because of their pro-life beliefs.
Well, switching up from pro-life issues for a moment, Trent, this one's for you. You mentioned that you were melancholic. Are you pure melancholic or a mixed temperament? And is there a temperament better for activism?
Well, this is a field that this is a topic I'm interested in, but I'm not an expert in it by any means. I did a show on my podcast not too long ago about the Four Temperaments. This is a psychological theory that develops from the late Roman period. You can find attestations to it in the writings of the physician Galen. And the idea was back then that the predominant medical theory was that your body was composed of four vital fluids that kept everything in balance, the four humors: blood, phlegm, bile, I can't remember the other one, but these four humors. Now we don't believe in the four humors anymore, that's not correct. But they believed that there were four basic personality traits based on these four basic liquids in the body. So there are cholerics, who are kind of extroverted leader types that are very assertive. There are sanguines, who are extroverts that are very people-oriented and people-pleasing. There are phlegmatics, who are introverted and want to have peaceable relations. They get along with everybody. And there are melancholics, who are introverted, but they care very much about truth and analyzing arguments. And so that's something, so they can cause division with people because they want to make sure they want to get everything right. That's what's most important to them. So, you know, cholerics, they want to run things. Sanguines want to be friends with everybody. Melancholics want to be right. And the phlegmatics want to just get along with everyone. So those are four basic personality temperaments, and you may start to be able to point them with other people you're here. And people have primary and secondary temperaments. A good book on the subject, if you're interested in it, is called The Temperament God Gave You. I forget the name of the author off the top of my head, but the book is called The Temperament God Gave You. And it's helpful to see we all have certain dispositions. I see it with my own kids. That's one of them, I'm not going to say who, because I believe children should have their own private lives, is very outward, sanguine temperament, very friendly, even as little, 2 or 3 years old. And the other, more introverted, more perfectionist, analytic about things, deliberate. And so when I've looked at it, I think I have a very melancholic temperament. I'm one who's very deliberate about things, detail-oriented. If things aren't exactly right, I can be easily driven to despair. But when it comes to dispositions for activism, any of the four can make you a good defender of life. You just have to learn to take the particular gifts that God has given you and apply them in the right area. So if you have a choleric temperament, you might be a great person to be running an organization because you know how to command and lead and get things done. If you're a melancholic, you might be a great researcher, a writer, a speaker. Maybe you have a sanguine temperament. You're someone who can fill this entire conference with 300 people because you know everybody and you bring them in. Maybe you're phlegmatic and you're the kind of person who can bring peace between different groups, either within the pro-life movement or beyond it, to help them to be reconciled with one another and help keep people together. So you really have to see your own temperament. Everyone has their strengths, and just seeing what strengths God has blessed you with, and weaknesses to humble you, and to use those for His glory, I would say.
Wonderful. I might flick this one to you, Raymond, or at least part of it. The question is, what is the involvement, if any, of the different Christian denominations in the pro-life movement in Australia and internationally?
In Australia, I don't know much about it. I left here many years ago. But internationally, I make a distinction between false ecumenism and true ecumenism. True ecumenism means we bring all peoples together under the same faith. And false ecumenism, to bring all faiths together into the same people. Just one of the opposite of the other. The Protestants and Jews, etc., who are of goodwill, I bring them together from the point of view of natural law, not religious ecumenism. By the law of our nature, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not do murder, we all agree on that, therefore we can work together, by all means. And it can actually is an occasion of conversion for them, to see that we are consistent with our vision of the gospel. Because according to Protestantism, strictly speaking, you have the Bible alone, sola scriptura. And so if I read the Bible and I come to the conclusion that abortion is correct, who are you to judge? So strictly speaking, Protestantism has the seed of relativism, of moral relativism. Every Tom, Dick, and Harriet, girls too, become involved in this, and they make their own religion. That's why it's so important to cooperate by all means in political and moral action to defend life, but having in mind that gradually they'll be invited to convert. I was flying from somewhere in the States. There was a Baptist man next to me, and we were chatting, and very, very much Baptist, and he was very much against the laws of the United States for being in favor of abortion. And towards the end, he said, because in our church we resolve everything by vote. Then I said, suppose one day they vote in favor of abortion. And then what? Is it not relativism? And then he began to think. I could say, well, that's the foundation of Martin Luther with the Bible alone, faith alone. If you all have to do is to believe in Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, and then bingo, no, not bingo, bingo is a Catholic thing. You say, and then, wow, you are saved, then you don't have to do good. Don't have to avoid evil. Like in Alabama, Father Beans, a convert to the church, he's a priest now. He was a Baptist minister. And one day, one lady came to the main pastor and said that her husband was cheating on her. And he said, that's no problem. He's already saved. He's accepted Jesus in his heart as his Lord and Savior. So it's okay, it does not matter. That's being very consistent with Luther's principle of Bible alone and faith alone. So then, in the beginning, by all means, we work together. But gradually, I'll be showing to them that it is inconsistent to be relativistic and at the same time defend objective good and evil. And in the end, you can have some good results on that.
Your Baptist friend, it's not far off what you suggested, because in the U.S., the Southern Baptists were for abortion in the 1970s. Okay. Their denomination was for it, and then they changed and voted against it in the 1980s. In fact, the National Right to Life Committee in the United States was created by the Catholic Church in 1972. And Protestants didn't end up joining the movement for about 10 years. So it's not so they had it once. Yes. What if they voted again? Yeah.
If I can comment briefly on the situation in Australia, many of you would have seen the collaboration that happened amongst so many of the Christian denominations during the abortion campaign. What I would like to say is probably unprecedented in terms of this type of activism. So we had the Catholic Church, obviously, the Greek Orthodox community very, very strong, the Eastern Catholic churches, the Maronites, the Melkites and others, the Presbyterians, the Seventh-day Adventists were all standing side by side, the Australian Christian Lobby, so many very varying denominations all coming together for a united cause. And that's not just what we're seeing in the pro-life movement, but more broadly. I work on a massive interfaith group of about 20 different religious communities in terms of religious freedom. So what we're seeing more and more in Australia probably is there are broader attacks on faith generally, and not only one specific religious faith, that communities are realising that we need to come together and defend the right to believe and the right to stand up for faith more generally. And so even amidst some of the really difficult losses we've had in recent years, the same-sex marriage debate, euthanasia in Victoria and Western Australia, abortion in New South Wales, one of the things that it is doing is building connections and building collaboration and unity amongst so many disparate faith communities, which is just wonderful and which will just make us stronger in the future. Obviously, our friends over at the Uniting Church are a bit of an outlier in this, but that's okay too. They're also the fastest decreasing religious denomination in the country, so by their fruits. Anyway, we're live streaming, so I'm going to leave it right there. Next, we're going to switch back to education. Just a couple of quick questions for Robert and Trent. Robert, the options for homeschooling in Australia, and is there an approved program or curriculum provided by the Archdiocese of Sydney for homeschooling? And Trent, if you wanted to make a comment on homeschooling in the United States as well, please.
Well, there is nothing provided officially, as far as I'm aware, by any diocese or archdiocese in Australia specifically for homeschoolers. I don't know if they would even be seeking that. I certainly have enormous respect and support for any parents who choose that path. I defend the right of any parent or parents who want to homeschool their children from any age up until the end of year 12, which is approximately 17 or 18 years of age. We certainly don't in Sydney Catholic Schools Office have a curriculum or textbooks for homeschoolers, because we design our material for our school context. If homeschoolers see any value in what we do, they're free to take it up. Same when I was Director of Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, we made very good resources, K to 6, 7 to 12 sacramental programs. They would have been available for homeschoolers if they so choose. So to put the matter simply, I think from the homeschoolers I know, they operate relatively independently. They decide as parents for themselves, and they access for themselves materials that are created by certain organisations or groups in the United States, homeschooling groups in the United States would access that material and use that material as the basis for teaching their children. But officially, I'm certainly not aware of anything that's coming from government or coming from a diocese or Catholic education officers. I think we need to be, though, very proud of the fact that in Australia we still have laws that allow parents to have that option. I know in certain countries, like in Germany, it's illegal to homeschool, and I think that's a fundamental right. We at Sydney Catholic Schools Office are always saying that parents are the first educators. They are, and homeschoolers choose to be the first, the middle and the last educators, and God bless them, that's their right. We as a school system only exist to support parents as the first educators.
Now, let me speak to that. I'll also say the point I made about the Southern Baptists, of course, is I want to make it clear that I'm grateful. I've enjoyed in the pro-life movement the collaboration we've had among Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox. Much of what I actually shared today in my teachings, like Trot and Toddler, many of the things that I was sharing, I've learned from Protestant friends who were starting the new pro-life apologetics in their Protestant churches back in the early 1990s. So just an addendum footnote to that. When it comes to homeschooling in the United States, we are blessed there once again to have a lot of personal freedoms, but they were fought for, including for homeschooling. In the early 20th century, the state of Oregon in 1922 tried to pass a law called the Oregon Compulsory School Act, which made it a crime to send a child to a Catholic school or to homeschool, that all children had to be sent to state schools at that time. And so the case ended up going to the Supreme Court. It was the Pierce versus Little Sisters school in Oregon. And the Supreme Court ruled that the state does not have the right to do that. In fact, there was a line in there in the case that was eventually quoted by Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Divini Ilius Magistri, And the line so we have a pope who quoted a U.S. Supreme Court decision about the role of the family in education, and the line he quoted was, "The child is not the mere creature of the state." The child is not the mere creature of the state. The primary educators of the child, those who have been entrusted with the responsibility to teach a child, are the child's parents. That does not, of course, require everyone to homeschool. It just means it is up to parents to decide what education a child will receive, and they should be free to educate their children, to be able to send them to Catholic school in Sydney. They're the ones who should be given the freedom to make that choice, because the children the children are entrusted to them. The child is not the mere creature of the state, and when we lose sight of that when it comes to the family, there are grave consequences.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you for a moment, Trent. I've got a comment on something that you said earlier and another question, and then we've got one final question for the whole panel to round it out. So I've got, Trent spoke about ensoulment and the church not having a position on when that happens. He said it was reasonable to believe it happens at conception, but the church doesn't teach it definitively. I believe the church does teach it definitively. The Immaculate Conception would be meaningless otherwise. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, what I would say there is that I would go back to the documents that the church has put forward. So I think what the objection is trying to say is that because Mary was preserved from original sin from the beginning of her existence, which occurs at conception as a part of the dogma, that therefore it follows that all people receive their souls at conception in the same way. But the church does not infer that kind of conclusion from that particular dogma. We can't extrapolate from what happened not saying miraculously, but what happened in a way that is different from all other human beings, how God preserved the Blessed Virgin from being conceived in original sin, what happened to her. The church has not extrapolated from that to reach a conclusion about how every other human being receives their soul or when that takes place. So what I would say is that we have to look at what the church has taught on these particular matters, and I forget the precise footnote. I want to say it's probably footnote 18, but it's in the 1974 Vatican. The document is called the Declaration on Procured Abortion. I think it's put out by the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, put out in 1974, and the same principle as irrational, has been forward over and over again. And that also looks at, throughout church history, there was a dispute about when ensoulment occurs. Now, a lot of that dispute was based on faulty biology. So St. Thomas Aquinas said, ensoulment takes place 40 days after conception, because that's when he and Augustine and others followed Aristotle's incorrect view that your development in the womb, you have a vegetable soul, then an animal soul, and then a rational soul, that you become a different kind of being. And once you have a rational body, you're capable of receiving a rational soul. And that's from Aristotelian development. William May, who is a moral theologian, who's written a great book called Catholic Bioethics and the Gift of Life, May says that if St. Thomas Aquinas knew about human genetics and DNA, he would understand that that is the formal cause of our development. And so he would have believed in immediate ensoulment based on if he had that biological knowledge, which he didn't have at that time. So what I would just say to that comment is that it's not faithful to what the church has taught in its own magisterial documents, and that we can't just take our opinions of some teachings to apply them. We have to see what has the church actually taught when it comes to these questions.
Okay, so one more for you. To someone who is coming around to belief in God and says, I can see how there was a Big Bang and evolution, but I can't figure out how matter came to be, like a final hurdle, what would you say?
I can't figure out how matter came to be.
Yes.
Well, I guess I don't understand precisely the nature of the question, but I would say that from my perspective, I cannot understand if the universe began to exist. I cannot understand how something can come from nothing. So I would agree, from a natural perspective, I don't see how something can come from nothing, or that something could exist without any reason whatsoever. But if God exists and God just is being itself, God is just existence. God is just, God is not a being in the universe who does stuff. God is being. He's not limited in any way. So if that's the case, if God just is existence, then it's not a stretch to say that God gives existence to potentiality that is our world. So I can understand something coming from nothing through divine creation, but not through a mere accident.
Raymond or Robert, do you have a comment on that? Or?
Oh no, wasn't going to make a comment, but I'm just fascinated about the whole concept of the origins of the term Big Bang. Actually, it was a derogatory term that this Professor Fred Hoyle hurled against the Father George Lemaitre. Now, Father George Lemaitre was Monsignor. He was a Belgian priest, and he first, building on Einstein's theories, realised that the universe was engaging in what's called redshift, that is expanding outwards from a central point. Now, he came to this conclusion in the 1920s, I think, early 20s, and this was debunking the science of the time, which was steady state theory. And steady state theory was pushed by Fred Hoyle and others to say that the universe was eternal. It always existed. It never was created, and there's no creator. So when Fred Hoyle heard about the work of Father George Lemaitre, and he asserting that the universe had a beginning, was that's consistent with Genesis, in the beginning, etc. It was Fred Hoyle who mocked this theory and called it the Big Bang Theory. But eventually, of course, Fred Hoyle and all his adherents had to succumb to the emerging science, and Einstein ratified the work of Lemaitre, confirmed the theories all behind it, and not only that, Fred Hoyle then is quoted as admitting that when you look at the universe, and you look at all the laws relating to physics, chemistry, biology, that there's no room, I'm half quoting him here, paraphrasing, there's no room for any chance. It seems to be the concoction of some type of design of an intelligence.
And also in the writings of Engels, when he tries to justify the atheism of Marxism, he points out that I found a very interesting bigoted reasoning. He said, regardless of how many mental circumvolutions we make, if we come to believe that the universe began one day, we cannot deny that God created it. But since God cannot possibly exist, therefore the universe is eternal. That's a kind of a nonsense, that opposing logic. Since God cannot exist, it begs the question that God cannot exist, therefore universe is eternal. It goes against all the laws of thermodynamics, goes everything against thermodynamics, that the universe had a beginning and you have an end. Huh?
You want a good book on the story of Monsignor Lemaitre? A good book by John Farrell. It's called The Day Without a Yesterday. And it's a good book that talks about the story of Monsignor Lemaitre and Fred Hoyle and Monsignor's ultimate vindication in the 1960s by the work of Robert Wilkinson and others with their anisotropy probes and things like that. So Day Without a Yesterday is a good book to follow up on that.
It's a good title too. Okay, now final question, and Raymond, I might start with you, and then anyone on the panel can chime in. How are we to respond to transgender persons in our church when they say that they are now as God intended them to be?
A transgender, a person who identifies as being of another sex. I remember giving a talk in the States 2 months ago or more, and one person said to me, Mr. de Souza, how can you possibly criticize the transgenders? You don't know the trauma that goes through their soul. I said, yes, I can identify with this, because it happened to me. There was a stage in my life when I, as a male, felt locked up in a female body. It came to an end when I was born. It is impossible to change sex. Every single cell in my body says that I am a man. Every single, when it is, if you have a crime scene and they find one strand of hair, they analyze it and know this is a man, they said all the details about it in the chromosomes. So then the transgender, I feel sorry for them, because in most cases, they end up in suicide. They go against nature. It is dreadful, but unfortunately with the culture of death, in which we live that is fanning this mentality. Even parents who want to change the gender of their children, and they take hormones and all kinds of things. I find the most radical protest against God our Lord, one who say, non serviam, I will not serve. I will be as I want to be. And these people deserve, by and large, our love, our charity, and our understanding, in the sense that we understand that they have a big problem and need to be solved, but doesn't go beyond that, because you can never, ever condone or accept the transgender mentality, never.
I'm very concerned about this from a school's perspective, because we do have a number of cases. I won't name the number, but we do have a number of cases in our school system at the moment. And the reason why I'm particularly concerned is that, well, firstly, I think in the longer term, medium to longer term, parents that have been responsible for changing the bodies of their children to another gender will be facing legal suits in the future from such children who become adults, and they'll be suing for child abuse. Because a lot of this is happening without the informed consent of people who are still children. And I think to admit students into a school system when they are still not adults, and to surrender to their demands, even if they are themselves demanding that they want to have gender reassignment surgery to become now a male or a female at an age when they're still not adults, is a very premature decision. A number of these people will be regretting their transitions in the future when they are fully fledged adults. It is a psychological condition. It's known as dysphoria, and it should be treated as a psychological condition. And again, speaking from the school's perspective, in that age group from 6 to 18, we shouldn't be submitting to their demands for gender reassignment surgery when they are not adults. When they're left the system, then they're free to make their own decisions as adults, but we as a school system should not be acquiescing to this.
Yeah, I think what's important is, well, God made me this way. How do we respond to this? We have to respond to it pastorally and graciously, but without compromising on truth. So I think for individuals who feel this way, we should affirm to them that they are valuable because they're made in the image of God. And a few principles I might follow with an interaction with these individuals to say, number one, because I value you and consider you to be valuable, I have to treat you well, and part of that means I cannot lie about you. It would be wrong for me to tell a lie about who you are, and for me, if I was to say you're a man or you're a woman, that would be lying about you if that's not actually the case. Second, I might ask them, help me understand, you're saying that you're not a man, you're a woman, even if you are biologically male. What does that mean? What do the terms man and woman refer to? What's interesting with the transgender issue is that it reinforces stereotypes about men and women that feminists have railed against for decades. They say, well, what does it mean that you're a woman? You know, that usually when people identify as transgender in this way, a man is a transgender woman, it's like, well, you know, I have the long hair now and heels and makeup. Well, that's not what makes someone. Imagine if I went up to a woman who has short hair and doesn't wear makeup and likes flats and wears pants, and I said, well, you're not really a woman. She'd say, well, you're really a sexist. I'd say, you're probably right. Because that's not what makes us men or women. I would say why are you identifying maleness or femaleness with these kinds of narrow cultural conventions instead of the broader biological nature that we're naturally ordered to? It becomes incoherent. And because I care about you, I don't want to lie about you and reinforce something that would be detrimental. A good resource that I would recommend on this subject is a book by Ryan Anderson called When Harry Became Sally. So that's the book, When Harry Became Sally, The Transgender Moment by Ryan Anderson, that I would recommend on the subject.
I might just add something really quickly. Gender dysphoria isn't the only time when you have people who have this misconception where their body doesn't match the way they feel inside, and obviously one of the prime examples is anorexia. And you would never, ever say to a person who was anorexic, who says to you, oh no, I'm fat, like I feel fat, you wouldn't say, yeah, that's actually right. And you keep going, you know, and give them the biological sort of assistance to continue in that, right? You say, no, your body doesn't match what your mind says, and so we actually have to fix your mind, right? Like we actually have to, sorry, fix your mind is a bad way of phrasing that, but we have to give you psychological care because obviously there is some type of disparity there that is not real. There's a condition called xenomelia where people will look at a limb or a part of their body and say that's actually not supposed to be there. And there are certain doctors, not that many, who will happily amputate a healthy leg or a healthy arm or something like that if the person is convinced that it's not supposed to be there. We wouldn't suggest that that's good medical care, and just because I look at my leg and say, that's not my leg and I shouldn't have it, that somebody then, a doctor should, as part of good medical care, cut it off. And so if there are these other circumstances where we see that and we say, well, just because your feelings don't match your biological reality, that doesn't mean we change your biological reality. For some reason, we just skip over that when it comes to sex. We all get a little bit flustered. But yeah, that's my comment, and I think I'm going to hand the mic to you now, Kev.